My name is Helena Stubbs, for those people that haven't met me before, and I'm the Village Halls Advisor for RAD, and our national body for the Rural Community Council Network, which we are part of. Our national body is ACRE. So when I refer to ACRE, which stands for Action with Communities in Rural England, they are the national body for England, all the counties in England, and of course they're the people that provide us with all the information sheets, the advice and the resources that we've been using all the way through COVID. So next slide, please, Sky. So the agenda for today, I've got a box on my screen. I'm just going to see if I can get rid of it. That's it. It's gone. So the agenda, yeah, 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. We may run over. If you have to go, obviously, I wouldn't expect people to have to stay beyond 12. But if people want to carry on a discussion and ask questions after 12 o'clock, I'm very happy to do that. So don't feel that at 12 o'clock we're going to finish. If you do want to stay and a discussion is carrying on after 12, that's absolutely fine. So that's just a brief overview there of the things that we're covering. ACRE have just published a follow-up report, and it was the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Village Halls survey. So I will just highlight the key findings. That's the first thing that we will talk about. And then the thing that most people are concerned about, the changes to step 4 and the easing of restrictions which have been changed. So, and it's mainly affecting implications to weddings and a few other activities, but it isn't a major change there. After coffee, we'll be talking about the business support grants that village and community halls should be getting. So we can discuss that briefly. And then COVID-19 reopening support. That is something that RAD is offering at the moment up to the end of September to community buildings that are struggling with their reopening and getting back on their feet again and running properly. So we'll talk about that. And throughout, if you do want to ask questions, put it in chat and we can perhaps, talk about it as we go along as well. Next slide, please. It's very difficult when we're all working from home. Sky's at home, I'm at home, you're all at home. So Sky is she's hosting the Zoom, so she has to move the slides on. So please bear with us when I keep asking for the next slide. Right. Last year, ACRE did a national survey. They do it every 10 years. And they did it, and a lot of the data from that survey didn't really capture the impact of COVID. So they decided to do a follow-up, and they contacted all the participants that took part in this survey last year, and they got quite a good response for those participants to complete a follow-up survey. And the findings and the report has just been published last week. This will be made available on our website, so it might be some interesting reading to see or compare your experience of running a building to what others generically have found to be the major impacts of the COVID-19. So just to let you know, that's not on our website yet, but it will be shortly. So do look out for that. We will send you the information and the link as well. Next slide. So just to talk about the main, the main findings from that survey. 15% played a formal role throughout emergency food provisions, NHS testing and vaccinations and childcare. To be honest, I'm quite surprised that it wasn't a higher percentage than 15%. I thought a lot more halls were opened for childcare through the lockdowns. So it's interesting from this particular survey, it said only 15% played a formal role. But it does actually show, and it reaffirms the importance of halls when there is an emergency, because they are often the designated place for community safety. So it shows the importance of a local village hall or community hall. But the sad thing, looking here, it says 1.4% will close permanently. So the impact of the financial impact and loss of their user groups, potentially loss of volunteers to manage the building. And I think that equates to about 140 halls closing nationally. That's what they've estimated from the statistics and the participants. So that's quite sad to think that the effect of COVID is that 140 village halls may be lost for good, and it's very difficult for them to reform once you've lost a service or a facility. Halls relied heavily on the business support grants, and I think maybe some of those that have closed could have been in the group that were not able or didn't know about business support grants, because the grants have been very generous, and if they were not aware of those and they're in financial difficulty, that may be a reason why that they've folded, which is quite a shame. A lot of halls have had to go into their reserves, their capital reserves, which obviously is there for that reason. But if those, if they'd got projects on the go and planned capital projects, then that's delaying some of that essential work that needs to be done. Greater dependency on volunteers. So those that had paid staff, 9% had to reduce staff hours. So again, the financial impact on mainly the bigger halls, they're the ones that will have the greatest financial loss. So some of the halls that had paid staff are finding it quite hard, and they're the ones that are struggling. Many of them are very worried about the long-term sustainability and the uncertainty of that, worried about the return of their regular user groups. They're finding that a lot of older people are still reluctant to come back into village halls, and that might continue. They may still not return to using the hall. And again, loss of volunteers. It's hard to get people to sign up and help the charity. Capital projects have been delayed or scrapped, mainly the new builds. So when they were planning and perhaps getting fundraising on the go, pandemic has completely thrown those plans to one side, and they are delayed or being scrapped altogether. But on the positive, some have planned new services and activities post-lockdown. So there are opportunities, and there are new types of services, activities that can take place. And again, we've talked about this in the past quite a lot, and it came up in the ACRE survey. The major concern and the major problem for charities is the idea of the trustee burnout post the pandemic. They've had to contend with so much legislation, and the concern and anxiety that has caused a lot of trustees that they've decided that they want to step down and resign from the post. So that's a major problem. Next slide, Sky, please. Yeah, very briefly, and this has been on all my presentations because it's the basics of how to reopen a hall safely. There are two essential aspects that managers have to consider: becoming a COVID-19 secure venue. And I should think at this stage in the pandemic that most halls, the majority of halls, should have gone through that process. The resources are there, the ACRE resources are there, the templates, the information, the guidance is all there on our website. So unless there are trustees that are so concerned and anxious and worried about it, I can't foresee that there'll be many that haven't got to that stage yet. And the other thing is to know what activities can take place at what step of the roadmap. And of course, we're coming towards the end of the roadmap now. So that's really going back to the basics. Next slide, please. Slide. So the main change then, what changed when Boris did the announcement on the 14th of June? So as we know, they postponed step 4, which should have taken place on Monday. So the lockdown easing was delayed. And as we know, it's been put back to the 19th of July. And apart from, there's just a few things that have changed, have eased, which I'm sure you are aware of, but it's nice to know a little bit more about those. So the key thing is the limit on weddings, civil partnerships, ceremonies, receptions, and that applies to funerals and wakes as well, has been lifted. So as from Monday, last Monday, the number limits to halls, COVID capacity venues and host will have to do a risk assessment. So the limit of 30 has been lifted, and it's not gauged by a limit, it's gauged by what the COVID safe capacity is for your space, indoors or outdoors. And the key thing here is to make sure that the event organisers do their own risk assessment to ensure social distancing can take place at the event. Now, they were doing that before, but I think they're just, the government are reiterating it here. It's saying, okay, we will let you have more numbers, but they are saying, and they're reinforcing the need for the risk assessment. But to be honest, it was needed anyway. For those of you that know that running events and events that have been allowed to take place in your venue. So we'll talk a bit about that as we go on. But another thing that might benefit some halls, if you've got an outdoor space or a recreation ground next to the hall, children can go on overnight trips in groups of 30. So scouts or guides or any other sort of youth group as part of a summer residential school can now use an outdoor space, and they would be able to use the facilities in the hall as well. So that's something that would be of benefit to some halls. Large pilot events probably are not going to affect halls. I think that's talking about big national events that have been taking place. For example, Download that took place last weekend, that was one of the government pilot events. I think some of the football Euro 2020 are pilot events. There are some other sports, arts and music events which are classed as these pilot events. So it doesn't really affect the local small halls. The only other thing that was eased, which isn't really affecting village halls at all, that they are letting residents of care homes that they don't need to self-isolate for 14 days after they've had a visit outside of the care home. And there's some caveats with that as well. So really the main changes are those three, or the top two there, are the ones that could benefit halls at the moment. But apart from that, it means that we should be in step 4, but we are still in step 3. For those of you that are fully familiar with what can and cannot take place at each step. If you are not sure, and if you haven't downloaded any of the ACRE resources, a very useful one to look at is Appendix D, and this is an activities table, and it sets out all the different activities, what can take place and at what stage. So if you downloaded that and look down the column where it says step 3, and it ticks those activities that can take place, or if there's any conditions with that activity, they're listed at the side. So that is the most useful guide. So we're still in step 3, basically, apart from those things that are on the screen now. Next slide, Sky, please. So as we say, we're still in step 3, which started on the 17th of May. So we are adhering to all of those conditions that are on that screen. I would imagine that you're all familiar with those because they, as you say, from the 17th of May. So the limit outside is still 30. And inside, the rule of 6 or 2 households. So if you're not familiar with those, please. So I think you're all familiar now. So let's go on to the next step then. Okay, so as we know, yeah, that's just an NHS poster to say that civil partnership ceremonies can be attended by as many people as the social distancing allows at the venue. So we will be talking about that. Next one, Sky, please. So okay. Most significant life events was mentioned on that step 3 poster, and it can be a little bit confusing what that actually means. So we know that the limit of 30 has been lifted for those weddings, receptions, wakes, christening, bar mitzvahs. It says including children of all ages there. So that's been lifted, but not, because we're still in step 3, dancers, teenage, adult birthday parties, anniversaries, any family sort of event, apart from the weddings and funerals, christenings, are still banned until the 19th of July. So dance floors and nightclubs are not permitted to open before step 4. So that's why there is no dancing allowed. Loud music is not permitted because people have to talk loudly over that to be heard. Performers are advised not to encourage impromptu dancing by audiences. This is going to be so difficult to marshal at a wedding. People want to get up and dance, but the regulations are that there should be no dancing and no singing. And also there should be no group singing by worshippers or audiences in a performance or in church. So singing in places of worship should take account of the performing arts guidance. So next page, please. This is a poster that Public Health England have issued since the latest changes. And it's quite a good visual guide just to show you what is and isn't allowed when it comes to weddings, civil partnership ceremonies and receptions. I think we all know the attendees limits will be determined by how many people the venue can safely accommodate with social distancing measures. And I think that's been raised as a question about how you would talk about the spacing and work that out. The safe COVID capacity of the venue is determined by the size of the room. There's information in the ACRE information sheet 10 on how you can work out the COVID capacity. As a rule of thumb, it's about a quarter of the normal capacity is the safe COVID capacity. It does say up to 50%. So if you're seating people in rows and they're all seating and facing forwards to a stage or they're watching a performance, then the capacity can be up to 50%. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Risk assessments. There is a sample risk assessment on the government website, and there is a list of websites and links a little bit further down on the presentation. But if you go to the wedding ceremonies government guidance and scroll down there, you will come across there are particular risk assessments for weddings and wakes, so that's useful. I don't know how much it differs to the ACRE risk assessment, because ACRE has got one for village hall managers themselves, but also for the hirers. So if you've got wedding organisers hiring a village hall, they can use either or you know, as long as they do a thorough risk assessment of things that they've got to consider. It says a little bit about other venues, because of course weddings can take place in private gardens, so there's slightly different regulations there. I'm not going to cover that. What is a little bit confusing on this poster, because it's talking about pre-wedding celebrations, which is the stag night, the hen night, and parties. Now, it's giving the impression there that they can take place in a village or a community hall, but they can't, because under the regulations for community buildings, family parties are still banned at step 3. So this is a generic poster. This poster is not just for community and village halls. This is a generic one for all sorts of wedding settings. So don't be put off by that, because you don't be fooled by that or confused. That is still not allowed in a village hall. So any type of family party or celebration shouldn't be taking place. If it was a hotel or a restaurant, then the regulations may be different, but not in a community hall. We know that dancing should not take place apart from the couple's first dance. You can have bands. You can have professional performers, but you can't have dancing and you can't have singing. And if it's during meal times and things, you don't want them to play loudly to avoid people having to talk loudly and shout over loud background music. So this is all part of the risk assessment, and it's up to the event organizer to ensure that the band keeps the noise level down. Again, guests are advised not to join in singing with bands or choirs. And the serving of food and drink, people should remain seated when consuming food or drink, even in outdoor settings. So for whatever reason, they don't want people walking around like in a buffet style, or hors d'oeuvres where people mingle. You're more likely to walk around and mingle if you're walking around with a plate of hors d'oeuvres. So people are meant to be seated so that they stay in those places throughout the whole event. And it's all down to avoid mingling and mixing with too many people. Yes, it is interesting. It says guests are advised not to sing. Again, this is why sometimes government guidance is a little bit confusing. I think we have to take that they're not allowed to. How you stop them is another matter, but I would say really discourage people not to sing. And it's up to the event organizer to make their guests aware of the regulations. It's all right doing a risk assessment, but if you're not actually going to implement it and inform the guests of what their responsibilities are as well, it's almost pointless doing it. So the event organizer is responsible to ensure that everybody knows what they can and can't do. So let's go on to the next slide. Right. Yes, that's just going over that point I said about the stag parties and hen do's. Please don't think that they can take place until step 4. They're still banned in village and community halls. And it is confusing. And it's, you know, confusing for people wanting to hire the venues as well. So I don't know if you're already getting people asking for these sort of events, but please don't allow those to take place until step 4. Next slide, Sky, please. Yeah, okay, that's just a poster, an NHS poster again, talking about the limits of 30 people, which are lifted, and putting that emphasis on the risk assessment beforehand. And there is the link there to find out more information about that. You will be given all of these slides, so you can follow those links and find out the information directly from the Gov website, gov.uk. It's essential. If you did reopen last year using the ACRE risk assessments. They have been updated. They were both, there's one for the event organizer and there's one for the village hall itself. They were updated in March. So if you're still using the old ones, please go onto our website, download the new updated versions of the risk assessments and make sure that you apply, you're using those. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's just covering any risks that you find that you highlight as that are listed as red. These are things that you have got to consider. It's mandatory that you look at the safety for that. The ones listed as orange, they are strongly recommended. The ones that are highlighted as green, actions that you might like to consider. So that shows the priority of the risks that you need to put in place. So red is the things that you really have to act on first of all. Right, okay, next slide, please. Talking about capacity limits, this is a picture pre-COVID. So this isn't an example of how to set up a wedding venue for COVID, but this is the only picture I could use as an example. It is a hall in Derbyshire. It really highlights how village halls look fantastic as wedding venues. But please don't think that is a good way to set it out. The government aren't setting specific limits. What they are saying, that you've got to consider the variables, because every hall and each individual event is going to be slightly different. So, for example, the number of guests that are coming from the same household can differ from event to event. So the numbers of when you're working out how many can be in the room, it will vary. So we're having to follow the rule of 6. It's indoors, so the rule of 6 still applies. It's the rule of 6 or 2 households. So as you know, a household can be a larger number. 2 households can be a larger number than 6 people. So the event organizer, to work out how many that venue can accommodate, needs to really do a proper analysis of the groups of people that are going to attend. And if it's, the wedding, the bride and groom or the bride's parents organising the event, they're going to know their guests pretty well. It's not like it's a public event. They're going to know who's coming from what household, usually pretty well. So it's easier for a wedding than maybe for other types of events. But they do need to really work out the size of the household, so how many people are going to come from a household or for 2 households, and you can group those people together. So you could have perhaps a table for 10 people, and that's classed as one group, which is larger than a group of 6. So if you've got several of those large households sitting together, you could possibly accommodate more people in that particular venue than if it was just groups of 6. So that is why the government isn't setting a limit on a certain number in a certain sized venue, because every venue is different. What they're saying is, if you apply the rules, the rule of 6, and or the 2 households can form a group, they have to work out what that hall can accommodate safely. So if you'd got, for example, a room of, or all your guests are coming from groups where there are 2 households, you could potentially perhaps have 4 or 5 large tables of people that are purely 2 households at each table. I mean, not likely to happen in that way, but it could potentially happen that way. And you could get more people in that room than you would if it was just tables of 6. Now, I don't know if I've explained that very well, but it's just to highlight that It's a case of having to work it out. And there has to be a gap between each table, the social distancing gap between each table. And the people sat at each table then should not mingle with anybody else from any of the other tables. When that's the same rule that's been applied all the way through, you know, when we've had the rule of 6 over the last several months anyway, it's the same principles that apply, but the government are saying it's up to you as the event organiser. So what we suggest is that you give your event planner and ask them to come up with a table plan, and then work out if that's a table of 6 or are they a table of 10 or 8, and explain that they're from 2 households, show how they're going to be socially distanced, and give that table plan back to the venue managers. Because then the managers can have a look at it just to double check that they think that they've calculated it properly, that their risk assessment looks reasonable, that people can access facilities like the toilets or get to the entrance or the exit without having to get too close to a table if it's positioned right next to the toilets or something. And if you think that's okay, then attach that to the special conditions of hire and make that part of the booking. It's almost like saying, yes, we agree to your table plan. We think that you've done it sensibly. You've looked at the different groups. And then it's up to that wedding planner or event planner to also sign the special conditions of hire to say that, yes, we are then going to monitor all the other social distancing, when people have to wear masks, when they can take the masks off, that they will not mingle with other people at other tables, that they're not going to sing, they're not going to dance, they're not going to shout loudly, and those sort of things. It is complicated, but it can be done. And if they want more information, it is on the government.uk website for weddings. And as I say, I've got the links for that. There isn't a definitive answer. It's just saying follow the rules, but work it out and try and see how many you can fit in a particular venue. So I'll go on to the next slide. We're talking about numbers. It excludes all of the staff. So don't, when it says the limits, when you're working out the capacity limits, the safe capacity limits, it doesn't include any of the staff, caterers, performers, stewards, or anybody that's there. So that's quite useful to know that they're not taken into account when you're working out social distancing. And if people do get up to go to the toilets, they do have to put the masks on. When they're sat at the tables, because it's for food and drink, they don't have to wear masks inside. Yeah, so that's really covering what I've just said. Seating 2 household groups together may permit more than 6 people, and that's what the organiser has to work out. And the more of those, the merrier, really, because you're going to get more people in. Another key thing is indoors, especially if you've got quite a few people indoors, have as many doors and windows open as possible. Maintain that ventilation through the building. I mean, if the organiser can manage indoor and outdoor guests seating, it may be that a gazebo or a marquee outside could accommodate more guests. That would be quite hard to manage because, again, the event organiser has got to ensure that people outside are not coming inside and mingling with the guests inside, and likewise people going outside and mingling, which is a natural thing that you would do at a wedding. It's extremely hard to stop people wanting to go and talk to other people, but that is what the regulations say. Table service only. Okay, next slide, Sky, please. And yeah, okay, they were the links on that. Where are we going? Back one. That's it. The those are the main links to get further guidance. Safe planning for weddings. Again, there's 2 links there, and a guide on funerals and commemorative events. So I'll move on from that, but that's just, you'll get that information so you can click on those. That's just to illustrate the point that I've just made about ventilation, the importance of ventilation. And the overarching hands, face, space, which was being, drilled into us right at the start of the pandemic, it's still just as important. I mean, it's easy to forget those basic principles. Now we're sort of hopefully coming towards the end of the pandemic. And they've added fresh air as one of those key principles as well. So it is important. Not so difficult in the summer, is it? We can have doors and windows open. But if somebody's organising an event where it's going into the evening, it's advisable that they, suggest to their guests, bring cardigans, coats, if it's outdoors and it's going to get cold into the evening, a shawl or something. If windows are open, people might want to have something to cover the shoulders, but it's good to recommend to your guests, do be prepared in case it gets chilly later on in the day. Okay, next slide. Right, so when they talk about capacity limits, if you're having a big event, for example, like a fete or an exhibition, art exhibition, it's talking about the limit that is set at any one time. So it's a bit like the supermarkets when they're letting so many people in and so many people out. By doing that, they know how many people are in the building at that one time. So if the event is a bit like a drop-in event, or a fete or something that's an all day long thing, or a fair or something inside, and you've got your capacity limit set, then you've got to apply that by knowing how many are in the building, how many are coming out, and how many are going in. So just be aware of that. This is any sort of event. And if you're a hall that's got more than one room, main hall, so you could potentially be a venue that's hosting several events at one time. So the bigger community centres have got several rooms available. They may have several events going on, which is okay. You can do that. But a risk assessment and a capacity limit would be set for each of those rooms and each of those events. But just ensure that they remain separate throughout. So that can be difficult if you've only got one set of toilets or one kitchen. It might be manageable, it might not be manageable, but that's down to the discretion of the hall managers, how many of those rooms they can safely let out at the same time. So again, that's the importance of the risk assessment. So venues can close or not proceed with an event if the event, EO means event organiser, if the event organiser cannot follow the safety guidelines. So this is really worst case scenario. So a venue manager or an event organiser, if an event's taking place and you realise that it's getting out of hand, that people are not social distancing or more people are coming in and you can't stop them, you can notify the police and or the local authority if you think that the numbers attending may exceed their expectations and significantly breach the COVID capacity of the venue, despite any steps they've taken to prevent this. So unlikely to happen, but if you were in a situation where, say, a hirer had said, we are going to monitor how many people are coming in, we're going to manage it, and then you realise as the event is taking place that that's not the case, what do you do? If you really, you can notify the police or the local authority for their advice and to advise them. And I think as trustees, you are almost covering yourselves because you've acted in the right way. So you would then follow the advice. It may be that you may just get a visit by the police. Unlikely to happen, but it's worth knowing that that's what the procedure should be. And I think that could be one of the risks highlighted in the risk assessment. You know, what if we can't control the number of people arriving to this event? What would we do? And I would write that down in the risk assessment as a reasonable and a precautionary action to take. Right, so the next slide, Sky, please. Right, so yeah, okay, coffee break time. So let's see what questions have arisen. Does a household include any bubbles too? A household, you can have a bubble. So you can have household and a bubble. So you could have two households with a bubble, I think, and that would form, that's my understanding. But I will double check on that one. Does anybody have a view on that, or have they come across that with events that they've been holding already? So I think my recollection is that a household can include a bubble. So it could be two households that have got bubbles, I believe, can join together. But I need to confirm that, yeah. Yeah, who is responsible to calculate it's the responsibility of the venue to set a basic capacity limit. I would say it's a responsibility of the event organizer. Say if it's a wedding or they're having people that are seated at tables, because you might be able to get more people in. So that suggestion in giving the event organizer a template of the room, and you could say, well, we can allow, for example, 40 people into this space under the rule of 6. But if you can prove to us that you've got lots of attendees who are from the same household, and you can seat more in that venue, you know, the numbers can increase. But they would have to prove back to the village hall booking secretary or the trustees that they've thought that through and worked out a table plan. If they can't do that, then it is down to the hall to set their capacity limit. So does that make sense? I think what the government is saying is venue is variable, the type of people attending are variable, households are variables, that they can't be definitive over the capacity limit. What they're saying is, this is the guidance, use your discretion if you can prove that you can do the social distancing safely, but within the rule of 6 regulations. Right, let's see any others. Yeah, so use the ACRE guidance to work out the capacity, safe capacity, and the regulations there are the same. As a rule of thumb, it's 25%. But if the layout of the room is for a performance, for example, then it's up to 50% because people are sat in rows and they're facing towards the stage. So do follow the guidance there. Right, okay. Well, we'll start again for the second half. So we're going to talk about, because we've talked about weddings really, but really it's covering any sort of event. As we're coming up to the summer, villages are thinking about fetes, carnivals, more outdoor events and whether they're going to be able to take place. It's it's difficult to plan ahead and to plan things on time, because a lot of the planning takes months in advance before an event can take place. So I don't know, I think a lot of villages have perhaps cancelled things for this summer, but they are allowed. It isn't illegal to have outdoor events. It's just the way that they're going to be managed and working out, because in the same way of working out a capacity limit of attendees inside, the same principle allows to outside. So when we're talking about a village hall rather than a village event, if the village hall is having an event on their grounds, if you're lucky enough to have, say, a garden or a playing fields, or you letting out maybe car park space, then the same principles apply for working out the capacity. There's a limit, set limit capacity, depending on the size and the area. I don't know the formula for that, but it will be available looking on the government website, working out capacity for outdoor facilities. Now the key guidance that I've been using, and it's called a guidance for organised outdoor events, and it's written for local authorities. It's the guidance for local authorities. It's available on the website. It is public. It's not just for local authorities, but that sets out all that you need to know really for organising an outdoor event. So I'm going to refer to that several times as we work through the slides in the second half. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Sky? Okay, I know, seeing this nice summer picture, this is over Haddon Village Hall. This was taken several years ago when that was opened. So, yeah. So I'm really missing the village fetes. I'm hoping that they will take place. At step 3, which we are at up to the 19th of July, means that 30 people can meet outdoors. So that's a limit. It's a bit like the rule of 6 for indoors. The rule of 30, it's not called the rule of 30, but it is 30 people can meet outside. That's really for just informal groups of people, family and friends. That's not talking about events that are being organised. So don't confuse the two. Don't think I'm having a fete, we can only have 30 people there. It doesn't work that way. It's really events that are organised by businesses, charities, local authorities or other statutory bodies. For example, it could be a school event, a school fundraiser or something like that. So it's okay to have those larger events. So the rule of 30 doesn't apply per se there. And the cap limit for outdoor events is 4,000 people, which is quite a lot of people, or 50%, whichever is the lowest. So 50% of the capacity limit for the size of the outdoor area. So again, like inside, you'd have to work out, say, the size of that garden outside over Haddon. They'd work out the size of the area where the event was going to take place. So there's a garden and there's car parking at the side. Work out the safe capacity that would be allowed to have an outdoor event. So when you're talking about 4,000 capacity or 50%, whichever is the lowest, it's going to obviously be that 50% of your safe capacity limit for outside. So that will be the lower figure that you have to go by. There's lots of information online. There's specific guidance, for example, just outdoor events, but there's specific guidance for fun fairs, performing arts outside, or sports events that are being held outside. So once that capacity limit is worked out, the idea is that groups of 30 people do not mingle. So it does get quite difficult, I would say, to manage that sort of an event. Again, it is down to the event organizer to mitigate all the risks to public health. And it's also easy to forget the normal hazards of having an event. It's not just COVID-19 that have to do their normal risk assessment, which shouldn't be overlooked. So there are all sorts of hazards when you're having an event. So the COVID-19 issues are the ones that are just added on to your normal risk assessment. And there will be samples of those online, as I've said, on the government.uk website. So next slide. So these things are allowed. These are not all of the items that are listed, but these are listed on that guidance for local authorities, outdoors events. The idea really is that they want to avoid large gatherings of people forming just in one place. So it has got to be managed. But these have been listed of things that can take place now. You know, there's no reason why these have to be postponed or put off. I've put well dressings on the end of village fetes and community fairs because I think that's quite pertinent for Derbyshire. And I know lots of villages do hold their well dressings. So there's no reason, as the government regulations are at the moment, there's no reason why they shouldn't go ahead. Car boot sales, market stalls, non-essential retail, that's been allowed to go ahead for quite a long time. Shows, agricultural shows, flower, gardening shows, animal and pet, all the sorts of things that happen in villages usually on an annual basis. But then other unusual things, steam, vintage car rallies, fun fairs, fairgrounds, circuses, they are legally allowed to go ahead. We heard just a few days ago, which was quite sad, that Chatsworth Country Fair has just been cancelled. So obviously they had been planning that up until only a few days ago, that was going to go ahead, but for whatever reason that's been cancelled. But just to show that large events can, you know, can go ahead. They obviously feel that it's not safe or they don't want to put themselves at that risk, but I think legally they can go ahead. And at step 3, I think the easing of the restrictions, it eased again at step 3 because the guidance said that people can now congregate in one area for the duration of an event. So if you're thinking of an outdoor event, say it's a sporting event, for example, and you've got spectators, you could have a group of up to 30 people or groups of up to 30 people. So it's not limiting it to 30. You can have different groups of up to 30 and they can congregate in one area for the duration of the event. So it may be a case of putting barriers up or ropes, marking out the ground that you've got so that you know that you can manage how people will hopefully stay put, stay within their group, not to mingle with other groups. So it needs careful planning and all the equipment and resources that you're going to need to manage large groups of people. Any food and drink that's served outside, I think the regulations are saying that people should be seated at tables. So if it's, say, for example, a food fair, they want to discourage people walking around and eating food. I'm not quite sure the rationale behind that. Maybe they have because they have to take the face masks off to eat and drink, but the regulations seem to always say that if there's an event where food and drink is being consumed, then the people should be sat at tables. And if it's alcohol, then they have to be served, people have to be served the food to their table. If there's not alcohol involved, I think people can go up and collect food from a table or a hatch, but that has to be managed, that people are doing it, you know, in a set sequence and they're not going to be queuing up too closely. it has to be managed so that that sort of system would flow properly. But if there's any alcohol involved, so say for example a wedding, then it has to be table service. People, the food and the drink has to be taken to that table. Very large events, if it is going to be over that maximum, up to over 4,000 for attendees, I think by law you have to notify the local authority. And the event organiser must assure the local authority that attendees will be dispersed across a significantly large area or distributed throughout the day. So they don't want that large number of people all congregating in one place. So they need evidence of how you're going to manage that, what measures you've put in place. So I doubt whether you are going to be holding such large events as those, but it may be that some villages are thinking, or a village hall may be thinking of a fete carnival or well-dressing type of event. So the basic principles, but on a smaller scale. And thinking about how you would mitigate any other risks of people forming crowds, entry and exit points, toilets, how they would, you know, their food and drink. And also car parking is another thing to consider, or public transport. If you've got lots of people arriving, is it safe that there are, you think that a lot of people are going to arrive by public transport? Is that going to be safe? So maybe that's something that Chatsworth have been looking at and considering. But the overarching thing is to prevent the mixing and to do the risk assessment and act upon it. So if you've identified hazards, to make sure that you're implementing them and following any ways to mitigate those hazards as much as reasonable. I don't think you can make anything risk-free. I think any health and safety officer would say nothing is risk-free. It's just being aware of the risks and introducing as much precautionary measures as you reasonably can do, and be aware of what potentially could go wrong. And what you would do. So for example, if too many people arrived at an event and you know that it's going to get out of hand and exceed your capacity limit, you would probably have the phone number of your local authority to hand, phone the police, phone the local authority, get their advice. Are they going to come out and manage it for you and police it, that sort of thing. Next slide, Sky, please. That's 22. So outdoor performances, so there could be shows, concerts. Again, that capacity limit depends on the outdoor area, what type of area it is. Do your risk assessment. Again, managing groups of up to 30, prevent mingling with other groups. Car parking to allow sufficient social distancing and spacing. And introduce measures to prevent clustering, communal dancing, singing, any physical contact outside that group of 30 people. And again, the local authorities are not there just to enforce, a bit like the police. They're there for advice as well. So if you're not sure and you want to double check, I think it's a good idea. To do your risk assessment, work out how many people you think are going to arrive and contact the local authority and say, actually, we're doing this event on this day. We've put these measures in place. Do you think we're on the right track? Can you advise us any further? And I'm sure they would be willing to offer what support they can. So don't be afraid to contact the local authority, ask for their advice, or just to double check. Do you think that we're okay? Do you think we're all right to do this? And I think then they're aware that that event is taking place as well. So I don't think that's a bad thing. It isn't mandatory, but I think as something in your risk assessment, you could say, we have contacted the local authority, we have followed their advice. And I think that's a good thing to do. That's good practice to do that. It may be that they're suggesting, you know, further roping areas off, or put further barriers up, or putting people a bit further back from the stage or something like that. So they're there to help, which I think you should use that. Next slide, Sky, please. We've mentioned this earlier on about, yeah, out of school groups can hire your playing field or your garden. I think that's great. So you know, you could potentially have a hiring for your outdoor space, and I think, you know, they would be allowed to use your toilets, maybe the kitchen facilities. It just depends if you've got other events, but this is going, if it's an overnight stay and they're not going to impinge on if you've got, say, a booking from 9 o'clock the following morning, if they can say, yes, we've used your kitchen and toilets, we'll be out of your hair by you know, 8 o'clock in the morning, we'll have cleaned down all the and wiped down all the surfaces that we've touched, then there should be no problem with that. But I think it'd be a good idea to consider in the risk assessment security. Obviously the Scouts or the Guides have got their risk assessments for how they're going to manage the children and the site, but do your risk assessments as well. And I think it's a good idea to perhaps inform your insurance company to see if they've got any comments on insurance implications for having people overnight stays on your property, on your ground. So again, that's just another precaution to take, but I think it's good sense. ACRE does have an information sheet on overnight stays in village halls. I've not actually read it, but I'm assuming it will cover the topic of outside overnight stays as well. But I can always double check. If that's something that you're interested in having a look at or purchasing, I can always check first if it covers the issues of overnight stays by camping outside rather than inside the building. So next slide. Bouncy castles. They, as far as we know, that they're allowed indoors. Indoor play areas have been allowed to use and to open from the 17th of May, as long as COVID-19 secure measures are in place. So bouncy castles would come under that, and we, you know, should be allowed. There is a government guidance for risk assessments at fun fairs, which is quite specific. And the Showman's Guild of Great Britain provides advice on safe use of bouncy castles. So I think that's where ACRE will have got their information from. So as long as these things are put into place, and I think if you're hiring a bouncing castle, it's going to be from a business. It's somebody running that as a business, I presume. So they would know all the safety measures that would have to be put in place. But it's things like allowing sufficient space around the bouncy castle for waiting parents and children to be socially distanced. How children would enter the castle, you know, same household groups or in the same groups as at school, or in out, you know, and follow the out of school settings guidance. So basically it's saying that bouncy castles are allowed. If it's a business that's running it, they would do their risk assessment, but it's good as event organisers to bear in mind what those risks might be. And providing things like the hand sanitize before entering to avoid the need for regular cleaning. It could be that the person doing the bouncy castle's got their own hand sanitizer as a business, they probably would. If not, you'd need to check that as the event organiser, you've looked at all the things that you would need to provide. So again, if you're having a fete and there's a bouncy castle, obviously there's always those risks and things to take into consideration. Next slide, Sky, please. And I think as managers of the venue that you're hiring out, you have always got at the back of your mind is, you know, are you going to think that the event organizer is going to adhere to everything that you've asked them to do? But if you think the event organizer won't or isn't able to stick to the COVID rules, you can refuse the booking. And you've got a valid reason to refuse the booking. If they've not done their risk assessment or it's not been done thoroughly. As we've said before, if the event is in progress already, the hall can contact the local authority or the police. Really, this is worst case scenario, and you don't really want an event to get to that stage. So that to try and avoid that sort of situation arising is to make sure that there's always clear instructions that the hall managers are giving out, so that your hirers know what is expected of them. So clear instructions and communications when planning events, and making sure hirers understand their responsibility. So it's essential that they have sight of special conditions of hire, because obviously COVID has created special conditions, the social distancing, the face coverings, the hand sanitizer, all the extra conditions that they have to comply with. If you're not familiar with it, ACRE have got special conditions of hire for those that haven't joined us before, and also the risk assessment. So if those things, if all the procedures and the preparation is done properly before an event, then the likelihood of it getting out of hand is going to be very, very slim indeed. But as trustees or parish councils or whoever's running the venue, you do have the right to cancel it beforehand, or bring in the police, whatever, if you think things are not going according to plan, it's getting out of hand. But the venue provider themselves, or the trustees, you are not expected to police the event. So you don't have to be on site. You don't actually have to be in attendance. You're not a hotel, you're not a restaurant where you would have staff on hand. You are a charity, you're a venue that's being hired out. It is not your responsibility to actually be there to police that event. Now, obviously, bigger community centres, bigger halls may want to do that. They may have a secretary who sits in an office on site all the time, for example, or a hall manager. The majority of village halls are small. They don't have paid staff. They don't have people on site. It's run by volunteers. So you're not expected to be there to police an event that, you've provided the hirer with all the information. You provide them with all the requirements. They should have signed the hiring agreement to say, we will agree to these conditions of hire. You'll have seen their risk assessment. So that is everything that you can really do. You can't be expected to police the events. So do be aware of that. If it's an event that you've organised, obviously that's a different matter. So if the village hall committee has organised a summer fair or a flower show, then that's a different matter. They are the hirers. They are the event organizer as well as the venue managers as well. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is basic requirements. This is the QR and the test and trace. This is just a government poster that's actually inside a restaurant, but it's the same principle really, that it is everybody attending an event has to leave their contact details. So ideally all halls have got to have a QR poster available on their premises, so people that can do their with their mobile phones, they can check in for test and trace. And if not, it's down to the event organizer to make sure that they have got the names and the contact details from all of their attendees. It's not the venue's responsibility, it's the event organizer, the hirer of the hall, their responsibility. I don't think it's unreasonable if you say, for example, a wedding, and you want to take as many precautions as possible to ask your guest to take lateral flow tests before attending. I think that's quite reasonable. I don't think you can enforce it, but if it's family and friends, they're not likely to refuse it. I think it's something that an individual, take that on an individual basis. But if there's 1 in 3 people have got asymmetric symptoms that have tested positive, there are still people out there that do not know that they've got the virus. So I think if I was having an event, I would just check. I mean, I went to my son's to a barbecue on Saturday, and we sat outside, and I did a lateral flow test that day because I just thought it was nice. It was only, I think there was about 8 of us outside, but at least I could say, well, actually, we've just done a test today, and I think that's a generous and reasonable thing to do. So if it's a wedding, I think that's a reasonable thing to ask your guests if they would do that. I'm hoping that there might be some guidance coming out on this issue. As you know, in the news at the moment about people travelling abroad, there's a lot of issues about quarantine, and if you've had the double vaccine, why should you have to do this and that and the other, and jump through hoops? And the government haven't really come up with any clear guidance on it. I don't think at this stage they know what is safe, what isn't safe, what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. As soon as we do know, we'll obviously spread that information. But there is an NHS app which you can show to prove that you've had the double vaccination. So is it reasonable for somebody at the door of a venue to ask that, or when taking bookings? I think that's down to the individual event organizer. If they do, they could possibly say, well, for those that are not vaccinated, we may have other people attending this event who are vulnerable, elderly people or health reasons. So if we know that you've not been double vaccinated, we can work out that we can sit those people further away from where you're going to be and make sure that you're not going to be anywhere near people who you think are more vulnerable. So I don't think that's unreasonable to ask the question, but you can't enforce it if people refuse to tell you the answer. So until we have more information about that, it's a difficult one to answer. So the next slide, please, Sky. Yeah, and just to be aware, I think we all know now that you can get these lateral flow tests very easily. So just a scenario question. We have children's parties, adult parties, and a village meeting booked before the 19th of July. Obviously, that was before the regulations changed. Should we cancel them? So children's parties can take place. They should be able to take place because they were allowed under Step 3 anyway, following the regulations of the out-of-school settings guidance, which would allow up to 15 adults, including professional supervisor, which could be a children's entertainer, preschool or activity leader. And then for the children, you would follow the hall's COVID capacity limit. So actually, the change that Boris announced, the latest, extending Step 4, really isn't affecting anything to do with children's parties. It's just carrying on as we have been doing before. For things like ventilation, making sure that there's a risk assessment, arrivals and pickup so that parents aren't all arriving at the same time and collecting children at the same time. And doing the risk assessment on the numbers, work out the sort of activity that the children will be doing, the age of the children, are they going to adhere to things like social distancing if they're very young children, are they going to hand sanitize, what activities you're going to do, what's the room layout going to be, So there isn't a set given number, but that is something that, you know, if you've got somebody who is used to managing children, or children's entertainer, school leader, etc., they would know what those out of school settings are and how to manage a children's party. So yes, they can go ahead. But different for adult parties, we said earlier on that family parties, they are going to have to be postponed. So anything that was booked from the 21st of June has now got to be put back till after the 19th of July. Public meetings can still go ahead because they're allowed under step 3 anyway. Again, the capacity number would be in accordance with the particular venues. COVID secure capacity limit, which is about 25%. But if you're seating people in rows and they're all facing forward, you know, to the parish council, whatever sort of meeting it is at the front, then it's up to 50% capacity. But again, anybody attending would have to wear masks. If they are people from the public at a meeting, a bit like an audience, they would be wearing masks. The people at the meeting, if they're socially distanced, would be removing their masks. Anybody there as a public, to be there as the public would have to wear masks. And also they can consider that if they were expecting large numbers, whether to have like a hybrid event where they could perhaps record it so that people can watch it remotely, but also people that haven't got IT facilities could attend in person at the meeting. So again, halls will vary on what their capacity is, have they got Wi-Fi, and have they got the technical skills and people that are able to manage like a high.
Hi everyone, we're so sorry about this. We've never had this issue before. We're not really sure what's happening with Helena's internet. Oh, I think she's trying to join now. So we'll resume in just a couple of minutes, and if not, I'll just go through the last couple of slides with you. I'm just going to give her a couple of minutes as I think she's rejoined again.
Hi Sky, yeah, it's just actually fingers crossed at the moment, so I better whiz through. Next slide. Right, that's the same as at step 3. Nothing has changed there. So if you're used to being managing a community building, sport and exercise, classes can go ahead. If they're run by businesses, charities or public bodies, they can go ahead. Yeah, that gives a little bit about the capacity limits to work out. It's all on our website as well. It's all in the guidance that you've probably got. Indoors, Appendix K, indoors and outdoor exercise and support. Yeah, informal or self-organised sport. So if it's not being organised by a business and just people want to go in and play badminton or something, again, it's the rule of 6 or 2 households or bubbles. So nothing's changed on that one, really. Next slide, Sky. Just a picture of, yeah, this was taken in the first lockdown, after the first lockdown, an arts group. So even though now we're in the rule of 6, you can still choose to have people sat individually like this, socially distanced, but they can't mingle. You'd have to work out, so many of them can perhaps get up and talk to each other, but you can sit them separately, but just be aware that only 6 people can actually get up and talk and mingle. So it's perhaps a little bit harder to manage. So that's not saying that's the best way to manage a group, but it's just an example. You can still seat people separately if you want to do, but just don't let them mingle in groups of more than 6. Next one, please, Sky. An outdoor family event. So this is not organised by a business, charity or local authority. So because it's not officially organised, it's an informal event, you can have this at your village hall. But then if, for example, it's an outdoor event, but they want to use the village hall and use it outdoors, you can only have up to 30 people because it's a family event. Okay. Tables sat out, allowing for social distancing as much as possible. Food and drink consumed seated, even though it's outside. That's the regulation. No requirement to wear face coverings outside, I don't think, in that situation. Music, but not so loud that people need to raise their voices. And again, dancing not allowed. So the rules, just to be aware that the rules are slightly different between a family event and those that are formally organised by businesses, charities or statutory bodies for outdoor gatherings. So it is allowed, but the numbers are restricted on that one. So next slide. So this is what we should be in now. We would have been in this from the 21st of June. That's been brought now. Obviously, we're hoping, fingers crossed, that it will be the 19th of July. There is a slight possibility it may be brought forward, but we've got to wait and see on that one. And then on all of these activities where it says no legal limit on social distancing, underneath it says for every one of these, subject to review. So these can still change. And holding of large events, it says here, subject to review. So they can potentially change. We hope they don't. We've got to see. And pilot events, like those large events, they're still continuing with the pilot events. So they're still gathering data to decide how to manage those moving forward. So next slide. We talked about the special conditions of hire. Those that you haven't or are not familiar with the resources that ACRE have developed for the whole of the COVID situation. When we talk about the event organizer, so the venue is giving the hirer, the event organizer, a set list of things, and that's obviously the basics, headings, of the things they are expected to agree to implement. So keep to capacity limits, social distancing, clinically vulnerable, any of their guests are clinically vulnerable, be aware of it, give them extra social distancing, the QR codes, test and trace, face coverings, whatever cleaning requirements you have set for your particular hall, before, during and after, that would be in your conditions of hire. Some halls do it by a cleaner, other halls will say we expect the hirer to clean before and after the event. But as long as the hirer knows what their responsibilities are, they are agreeing to them when they sign the hiring agreement. Avoid social contact with other groups hiring the venue. So if it's a larger venue with other events taking place, knowing exactly if it's an activity that is permitted, for example. So you can't hire it out to somebody where it's not legally, allowed to do that. And if it's something like a sports event or a performing arts, or maybe some sort of groups, WI, that they also refer to and comply with whatever guidance is coming out from their governing body. So, for example, the National Federation of WIs said that no WI group should meet last summer, when in actual fact lots of other groups were able to go back into village halls after the first lockdown. So WIs across the country had to follow the guidance from the National Federation of WIs, which was actually slightly different to what other groups were actually allowed to do. So refer to their governing bodies. So they are agreeing, when they sign it, going back to avoiding problems at an event, make sure that the hirer knows what is expected of them, and it's their responsibility to make sure that their attendees know what is expected of them. So, you know, it's passing down that. It's about communications, it's about understanding and having clear instructions. So if you've not seen it, you can download this special conditions of hire from our website again, along with all the other resources. Next slide, Sky, please. Now, going on to grants, we've talked about this many times, but maybe some of you here are not aware of the business support grants that are available. There is a Restart grant that was to cover the financial loss for the third lockdown. So from the 1st of April onwards, there is financial support to venues. Community venues are eligible. It depends if you are a rateable venue or you're out of the rate system. So there's 2 grants, and you need to be aware whether you've got a rateable value. If you're not sure, do get in contact with me at RAD, because we've helped lots of halls who thought they were not eligible, and they have been actually eligible to get this funding, and we've supported them through that process. So if you are uncertain, please do check, because it's silly to leave it to you know, the deadline or after the deadline and find out that you could have got some funding. They have put the deadline back now. It was the 30th of June. It's been put now back to the 30th of July. So it is giving venues a little bit extra time to you know, check if they're eligible and apply. So do act on it if you have not done so already. So if you are rateable, you should get the Restart grant. If you are out of the rate system, so if it's, say, for example, a church hall or a hall that's run as a statutory managed hall, they are out of the rate system. And again, there may be some support called the Additional Restriction Support Grant, and they are discretionary. So what that means is you apply to the local authority, and it isn't a set amount that you get, unlike the Restart grant is a set amount depending on your rateable value. The discretionary grants means that the local authority can give you whatever funding they at their discretion. So it isn't a set amount. It may be a little bit less than the other types of venues, but it's still money that could help you through, you know, the financial difficulties of the lockdown. So don't leave it too late to find out. That's all I can say on that. So, and again, look on your local authorities' websites, because all the information should be there. If you're not certain, contact either RAD or your local authority. We do not want you to miss out on that funding. So next slide, please, Sky. I think I'm nearly at the end. Yeah, that's sort of come the end of the presentation. But just to highlight that RAD is actually offering at the moment some free one-to-one support. So if there's any venue out there, community venue, that is struggling to recover, to reopen, to access the grants, to recruit new volunteers, whatever, or plan ahead, the sustainability, looking forward. This is time limited. It's only for the next 3 months. So if you think that you could do with a bit of help, it's not going to cost you anything. You can just go on that SurveyMonkey form and just put your details in there, or contact us, and we can have a chat about it. And, you know, hopefully, you know, perhaps be able to come out and have a visit to your venue, or do it online. So do you know, consider it while that opportunity is there. And the next slide is just say about safeguarding. This is another project that RAD is doing with ACRE at the moment, and it's just about highlighting the fact that we've been so focused on COVID for the last year and a bit. It's so easy for any organisation to forget all their other legal responsibilities as well. So ACRE have got this safeguarding, it's just to highlight it to village halls. The aim is to make sure that every village hall across the country is aware of their safeguarding responsibilities. So again, go to our website. There's lots of resources, lots of links to national agencies and safeguarding agencies, and the safeguarding board, I think, for Derbyshire links. So what you know, the links where you'd have to report safeguarding issues. And we've also got an information sheet that hall committees can obtain from RAD that sets out what their responsibilities are in quite a simple and basic way. So, you know, the aim is that no hall should be falling foul of the law when it comes to safeguarding. Right. Any questions? After all of that and all of that drama of dipping in and out with my internet, let's see what's in the chat. Right, as far as you know, will there be guidance after the 19th of July? Talking about guidance, I know ACRE have said to us that they're not updating. We're on version 10 at the moment, and all the appendices have all been updated in accordance with changes in legislation. They have told us that the changes that the government announced, extending step 4 for a month, they're not updating all of the documents, but the changes are quite simple, if you know what I mean. It's only affecting things like the weddings and the wakes and children's overnight accommodation. So it wasn't worth them revamping the whole information sheet. So just be aware that ACRE won't be updating that. We don't know whether the government are going to keep issuing guidance. I can't see it just stopping. I think that there will be ongoing support from the government. There may be an uprise and a bit of a wave coming again in the winter. They're not just going to stop. We're not going to go back to normal 100% from the 19th of July. There may be still some restrictions on social distancing, on wearing of face masks, but at the moment we don't know. I think the government are in that, trying to decide what that is going to be. So I think that there will be some guidance after the 19th of July. Back to normal or back to the new normal, whatever that is, we don't know yet. So it's difficult to answer that question. Yeah, slides will be available and a link to the recording, which probably is a bit not hit and miss, but we've had quite a few interruptions on the recording.